there's no way I could have written a book in 49 days had I not had that experience beforehand. Like, had I had to learn that stuff in that phase, it really would have taken 5 years to write the book.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Gumroad podcast. I'm your host, Justin Michaelet, a senior writer at Gumroad, where I deconstruct the tactics, strategies, and processes of top creators. Each week on the podcast, I interview creators and digital entrepreneurs who are at the top of their field. On this week's episode, I interviewed Steph Smith, head of trends at The Hustle and author of Doing Content Right and Doing Time Right. We talked about her products, writing, her creative process, and more. I just loved this conversation. Enjoy. All right. Welcome to the Gumroad podcast. Our guest today is Steph Smith, the powerhouse creator, writer, thinker, indie maker, and growth marketer and head of trends at The Hustle. Welcome, Steph.
Thanks so much, Justin. That was a lot of titles.
Yes, and they're all apt. Today, we're taking the show on the road. I'm in the Florida Keys, so I'm channeling my inner Ernest Hemingway and filming and taping with you remotely. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, and congrats on your success on Gumroad. You have crushed it. Doing Content Right is a phenomenal product. People should buy it straight up. Anyone who is producing content of any kind. So I just want to put that out there.
Thank you.
I'm interested in talking with you about your creative process and going deep into the mechanics of actually how you built that product in particular, and then sort of broadening out from there. So let's start from the very beginning of when you conceived Doing Content Right and how you started to sort of plan out the process of creating it.
Sure. So I guess there's kind of two answers here. And one of them is like when the actual book, I knew it was happening. But even prior to that, the, I guess, more accurate answer is that I didn't know this was coming for a long time, but I was kind of preparing for it throughout several years, actually. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think a lot of creators, they're like, oh, you're going to have this aha moment of like, of course, I'm going to build this exact product in this exact way, and it's going to come out exactly as I expect. And that never happens, right? So what happened with me is I've been working, as you mentioned, as a growth marketer. I write as part of that and have built up some of my own publications as well as company publications over the last many years. And throughout that time, I'd just been learning a lot, right? But I'd also been documenting a lot of it just from, my own purpose, or just as I would see things online, I would kind of compile them. I had this one like very, very long document in Evernote. And then actually when I had launched my own blog in, I think 2019, that year, I also had written an outline for a blog article that was basically like, wow, my blog has taken off more than I expected. Like, here's everything I've learned. And so that outline for that article ended up being several thousand words. And I was like, oh my God. And I just got overwhelmed and I didn't fully finish it. But what happened is I had resurfaced that outline later, a year later, and also had, generated more experience and more ideas behind this. And I was like, wow, I have a lot to say here. And that was combined with the fact that I had seen a lot of products out there that were touting like helping people with content that were really not great. I always say that like at best they meant well, but it wasn't excellent. And at worst it was like actually misleading and maybe inaccurate. And so I was just like, wow, I think there's a gap here, but I still didn't know for sure. And I still didn't even know if it would be like a full length book. And so what I did is I tweeted about it. I just said, hey, I found this old outline. Would people pay $10 if I finished this? And a lot of people were like, heck yes. A lot of people were like, yes, I'd even pay more than that. And then that kind of just like got the ball rolling of like, okay, I guess I'm going to do this. And then, within a couple hours, I threw up a Gumroad pre-sale page and got a bunch of pre-sales. And then it was just, I had to like stick my head in the sand and start writing it. And it took around 2 months to write it. It was 50 days or 49 days to be precise. And throughout that time, again, like my original, even at the beginning, at like day zero of that, the vision for it was much different than what I ended up producing, but that's kind of the arc of what happened.
Yeah. So it's a PDF, it's a Mobi, it's a EPUB, it's all of those, but it's a lot more than that even, because there's video tutorials. I think you have a Slack community, and there's a whole sort of other set of things that are included in it. Can you describe basically how you've constructed it?
Yeah, so exactly. When I had first written it, I was like, is this just going to be like an online article? Then obviously when I was selling it, I was like, okay, it's probably going to be a PDF. But as I was going through it, one thing that was important to me was not just to make a bunch of sales, but hopefully reduce the friction for people to use it. And as I went through that, I was like, okay, well then, of course, like a lot of people read on their Kindle or Kobo or some sort of e-reader. So I got all the e-reader stuff together. And then I was thinking, okay, well, I know from my own experience, I buy books all the time and I don't read them. And so I was like, how do I actually get people to read this or to get the knowledge from it? So then the next natural thing was like, maybe I'll do these video live sessions so that if someone doesn't have the time to read, they can just show up to these or watch them after the fact and maybe not get 100% of the content, but get maybe 50 or something better than zero. And so I did that. And then, as you said, there's a community, there's a couple other aspects of it that, again, the reason behind it was, obviously some people could say that you're going to make more sales because there's more value there. But for me, it was mostly like, how do I, again, reduce the friction such that someone gets some value out of this? Because also there's a selfish reasoning behind that as well, where just no one's going to share your product if they don't engage with your product and get value from it. And so if you just focus on creating a product and not actually reducing the friction for people to consume it, then you're probably doing yourself a disservice on, the sales side as well. So yeah, that was kind of the theory behind adding all of these different kind of like iterations of the same product.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask you next. That you incorporated on the order of, say, 20 exercises within the product.
Oh, yes.
Those are fascinating to me because I'm wondering whether you created those in a vacuum or you had feedback along the way with a beta test or an alpha cohort of people that were looking at first drafts, second drafts, third drafts, and that sort of thing.
No, it's funny because I've had, since publishing it, a lot of people ask me like, who was your editor? Or like, not because the editing was great, but just like, how did you go? And, like, what were the steps that you took to create the final product? And it's funny because it was done in such a short period. Now, I will caveat that I will say it was physically created maybe in a short period, but of course there was like the lead up of all the learning before that. But during that short period, because it was so short, I didn't have anyone edit anything, in which in fact, when I published, there was a lot of mistakes, not mistakes of like incorrect things that I was saying, but, typos or things like formatted slightly off. And so I had no one edit my stuff. Maybe I would have benefited from that, but I would say that I went into this with, again, years of like thinking through like what I wanted to say, and also with the exercises, also in the past teaching other people some of this stuff and kind of having a good understanding of like where people go wrong or like what exercises could kind of help steer people in the right direction. So of course people can always like benefit from feedback and iteration cycles, but I would say I think I actually benefited from having like just a really rigid short schedule to get this thing out there. Because I think the flip side of that is when you do say, hey, I need to get all this feedback, I need to like have all of these steps, it's less likely that you'll ever actually publish something. And so for me, maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was good enough that I was like happy to launch it without some of that feedback.
Yeah, I saw a tweet today from, I don't know who posted the tweet, but it basically said Jack Kerouac was interviewed at one point and asked how long it took him to write On the Road. And he said 3 weeks. And somebody said, well, how long were you on the road? And he said 7 years. So
exactly
similar to the story.
Exactly. So it took him 7 years and 3 weeks. So I say the same thing. It took me like, let's say 5 years and 49 days. And that's really important because a lot of people will think just again about that stage of like creating something. But the prior stage is really important because if you're not thinking actively about like what you're going to create in the future or like what you've learned, then it's a lot harder. Like there's no way I could have written a book in 49 days had I not had that experience beforehand, right? Like had I had to learn that stuff in that phase, like it really would have taken 5 years to write the book, right? So it's important to like, when people hear me say it took 49 days, like if you were to write a book about content or really anything and you don't have the experience with it, like you're not going to write a good book in 49 days.
Yeah. So a lot of people talk about the creator economy and people aspire to be creators these days. It seems like it comes extremely naturally to you. Are you like an inveterate creator? Like why did you start the blog in the first place? And was that just came out of you regardless of whether you wanted to or not?
Sure. I think that's an excellent question and something that a lot of people should think through because as you mentioned, we are now in, as people say, this like creator economy and everyone's excited to quit their jobs and go solo. what I think is important for people to think about here is, yes, we have more tools than ever to be a creator and to monetize your creations. And it's just easier than ever to, if you want to go that route, to do that. Now, that doesn't mean everyone should or has to. And one really important thing about the way I think I do it that benefits me, again, not really the route that everyone should take, is that I actually am not a full-time creator. I have a full-time job. I've had a full-time job since I graduated university. And I think for some people this wouldn't work, but for me, it's exactly what allows me to be such a excited, energetic creator, because what happens is I now have my financial stability coming from my job, right? And of course, I also like my job, right? So that's another pro, and I get to learn through my job. But then when it comes to my creations, there's not this pressure to monetize everything right away. There's not this pressure where if something doesn't go well, then all of a sudden I'm going to be on the streets or something. And I love that, because what that means is that everything that I do, whether it's my book, whether it's my site or my open page, it's all because I want to do it. And no one's pressuring me to do it. I just want to do it. It doesn't matter if it makes absolutely no money. I just enjoy it, right? And so maybe me and my creations come across more naturally because I actually again, I'm not pressured to do this. I'm not trying to, I have made money through this, which is, definitely a perk of this, but that's not my end goal. And so I feel maybe it does come a little more naturally, not saying that the actual act of creation is more natural, but because again, I'm not banking on this for my financial stability. And I think that's actually where a lot of creators go wrong. They think of it as a binary thing where it's you either work full time in a job, or you have to be a high school dropout like Zuckerberg to be successful. And I think actually at the beginning, you should go and play around with creating to see if it's even what you like, because I think a lot of people kind of idolize oh, look at these people who are hyper successful and making money on their own. I want to do that. But then they don't see the back end of that, of how hard they have to work and how much pressure it is and how unstable it is. So anyway, that was kind of a long way of saying that I maybe come across a certain way just because I do have that financial freedom and that just pure enjoyment in whatever I do or whatever I choose to create on my own. Versus, again, I think some people idolize that and then they go all in and they realize oh my God, it's actually really stressful to not have a paycheck. And because I have to rely on this for my paycheck, I kind of have to create in a way that maybe doesn't feel as natural or as, what's the word here? True to themselves and what they want to produce. So I think that's just something really important to keep in mind if people are considering, being a part of this creator economy. Again, it's the best time in the world if you want to be a part of this, but it's also not necessary. And there's, a lot of other ways to be successful.
Yeah. A couple of follow-up questions to that. Agree with everything you just said. I mean, more or less, you can literally afford to play the long game.
Yes, exactly.
And I noticed, because I work at Gumroad, I can see your sales page and so forth. It's a very spiky, nonlinear sales. There's been some days where you had an enormous spike in sales and some days not. Do you attribute that to some of the promotion that you've done, and how did that exactly work?
Yeah. So of course, whenever you launch a product or whenever you do a specific sale, you're going to see a spike, which is what I've seen. And I think most creators will see. I think for me, what I was actually surprised by was the long tail sales that have come with this product. So when I launched it, I did expect that I would see a spike. And then maybe if I ran a promo again, I'd see a spike. But what I've been surprised by is that just, I guess due to word of mouth or something, because sometimes I'll tweet about it, or sometimes again, I'll do a promo or something like that. But I really don't promote it in ways that I think some creators promote their work. I hardly ever tweet about it and I don't run any ads to it. But I guess through word of mouth, people are still buying it. In fact, it was launched, I guess, almost a year ago now, which is crazy. But there have been, I think, 10 days or less with 0 sales throughout that time period. Again, and there are many more days than that where I'm not doing anything to promote it or drive sales to it. So it's really interesting that I think that was actually counter to my expectation, where of course, as a creator, you're going to see ups and downs. But that was really surprising to me that the product, if you create a great one, it kind of sustains itself in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah. It seems to me that your 7-day rolling average sales is higher now than it was in the first month or second month.
Yeah, it definitely is, which is crazy to me as well.
Yeah. How many hours so you said it took 49 days or so. Like, how many hours do you think it took you to create this product?
Oh man. I mean, it's so hard to say. It's kind of like asking someone who works remotely, like, how much do you work this week? And they're like, I don't know. What do you count as work, right? Like, is it just like me sitting at my computer, or is it me like physically typing? But I spent pretty much every day throughout that period, and like many hours a day. So let's say on average, I spent 4 hours. It might have been more than that, but let's say 4 times 50, like, so 200 hours, which actually doesn't sound so crazy when you say it like that. But I always find this kind of way of thinking about time interesting, where I'd learned to code a couple years ago, and I think about it in a similar way, where really anything that you do, it just takes reps, right? It just takes time. And with that, with learning to code, it sounds like this like big audacious goal if you don't quite know how to do it. But I actually said the same thing when I had tracked it throughout that year, and I'd look back, and it took me around, I think, 300 hours. And again, it was kind of this like rough math of like, I did it this many days and this many hours per day. But 300 hours can be split where it's like 1 hour a day. It could be like 1 hour a week, in which case it takes like, 5+ years. Or if you really condense it and you work really hard, you can learn to code in a matter of months, the same way that you can write a book in a matter of months, if you have that, like, if you have that time and that like dedication to it. But I do think it's interesting where you can really compress stuff if you are just focused. And for me, that actually worked better than dragging it out.
Yeah. It seems like you time boxed the effort, but I want to talk about constraints a little bit, because this is such a robust product that it seemed like you removed all the constraints from yourself and said, I'm going to write every single thing that comes to my mind about this topic, which is hard oftentimes for creators to do, rather than just like developing a structure, keeping yourself contained, if you will. Was that, and let me add a layer to this question, because it seems like you're a process-oriented person where you've got this wonderful open 2021 goals page, and you feed it through Zaps, and it's all very organized. So do you consider yourself like a super organized, parallel processing, and rather serial processing creator type, where you're just like constantly on task?
No. I mean, the simple answer to that is no. It's funny because I think I am organized in the sense that, like, if I want to get something done, or if I want to get many things done, like, they will get done. But I am very inconsistent. I'm not a scheduled person. I'm not like a regimented person. In fact, I think a lot of people, because maybe outwardly I seem that way. Like, I remember even in an old job I had, someone was like making a joke that like, man, I'd love to see your Evernote. I'm like, no, you would not like to see my Evernote. Like, it is so messy and all over the place, but it works for me, right? And so I am very data driven. And so I do things that maybe some other people don't do. For example, I track anything that's important to me. I have this like spreadsheet and only a couple things like exercise, things, it sounds silly, but like calling my parents, because that's something that I always forget to do. And it's just like a tracker. And it's not that I have to do it every week. It's more so to like keep tabs on if I'm doing things that are important to me. So I do things like that, which maybe make me sound really organized. But then if you actually look at the data in that spreadsheet, you're like, oh no, you're not a very, again, like scheduled, regimented person. And I think it works for me. I think some people need to be super scheduled. But the reason you mentioned constraints of the book, the reason that I needed constraints is because when I let things drag out, because I am actually like a not very regimented person, then nothing ever gets out there. And so that's why I almost needed to be like, you need to publish this within 2 months, because if you don't publish it within 2 months, like, you will never publish it. And I know that about myself. So I think, if people are listening and they're like, oh, should I be more scheduled or not? It's less about like one way being right, but knowing how you are and knowing kind of your own pitfalls in the way that you're productive or the way that you create, and then kind of setting your own guardrails, whatever they may need to be, so that you can be more effective.
That makes sense. I want to ask this question to everybody who's on the podcast, because I have a personal obsession with it. Tell me about your information diet and how you control it, how closely you pay attention to certain things. and basically how you engineer what you consume. And because I always ask this because it seems to me creation and consumption are inextricably linked.
Yes, it's such an important question. And you're completely right that the same way that like what you eat turns into like how your body like manifests it physically, the same thing is true with like your mind, right? What you feed it is going to impact the way that it functions. And so I guess a couple things in what I do, I'm certainly not perfect. Anyone that like touts being perfect and like never watching Netflix or like never, watching TV shows that are not just highly intellectual is lying, right? So I'll caveat that I do a lot of things that most people do that isn't great for my consumption or information consumption. But a couple of things that I do that I think have helped me kind of create a better diet or information diet are, one thing is I spend a lot of time on Twitter. Twitter is mostly junk. Like, let's all just admit that or acknowledge that first. But since I really enjoy it, I also do get a lot of value from it. The most important thing I've done on Twitter is to never follow more than 100 people. And this is not, some people, when they hear me say this, they think it's like something that I do to like look cool or say, oh, I only follow this number of people. But it's truly because of this information diet where at the end of the day, would you rather Twitter use its algorithm to say like, we're going to show you these things amongst 5,000 people that you follow? Or would you rather say, hey, I know I get a lot of value from these people, and therefore I'm only going to constrain like what I'm allowed to see on this platform. And then what I do actually is 100 is, you hit that number quite quickly. And so what happens is there's always people that I'm like, oh man, that person's so interesting, or I could learn from them. And so I will follow them. But if I want to follow them, I have to unfollow someone else. And it's actually a good exercise, the same way that you should purge the newsletters that you read if you're not getting value from them anymore. I do the same thing where I look through my list and I'm like, this person hasn't really been delivering value. And again, this maybe sounds a little like pompous or something, but that's not the intention. It's that you have zero-sum attention. I think if people acknowledge that if you are reading one tweet, you are not reading another tweet, right? If you're reading one newsletter, you're not reading another newsletter. And so your attention, time, there's so many positive sum things in the world, but time is not positive sum. And so if you realize you have zero-sum attention, then you should curate that in an effective way. So that's the one thing I do in Twitter. And then the same thing I do with newsletters, where if I haven't gotten value from one, like unsubscribe from that, like do that instead of just like letting it go into your newsletter. And then the other thing that I find with newsletters is that basically your email can be really distracting, right? If you get a newsletter on Monday and Wednesday and in the morning and night, and like, it's hard to like read them all the time and get value from them without it distracting you. So I mean, you don't need to use Superhuman. Gmail does the same thing, but I use Superhuman to schedule every time I get a newsletter, I'll just remind myself on Sunday morning, and then I'll read them all in one batch. So I still get the value from them, but they're not like these constant pinging distractions. So I think that's been really helpful. But I think overall, I think it's whatever processes work for you is fine, but just try not to let these like spurts of information distract you all the time. And then tied to that, don't be afraid to unsubscribe from things. It's really actually important. It's like essential for you to like advance yourself, I think, is to reduce the things that no longer bring you value. And it's totally fine if something used to bring you value, but then acknowledge that it no longer does.
Yeah. Do you have a broad set of categories of folks you follow? Does it span the gamut from your interests in remote work, women in tech, coding, creation, or is it much more tightly in like this vertical of content and things like that?
No, it is. Like you said, it's all over the place. I'm just looking through right now. There's definitely a lot of people who are like indie makers or indie creators. There's definitely people who are like founders of companies, typically like tech companies. There's people who are just generally like, I guess, thought leaders, you could say. People like Tim Urban, that kind of person, James Clear. And so, yeah, it really spans a wide. And then there's some random people, like there's this one guy like Julian Glander who just creates these like really, really cool graphics, and I love his work. There's another guy called like VisaCan, which I just think is like ideas are just really interesting. And so they don't all fit in these like unique buckets, but I think overall there are themes in the people I follow. But I mean, it depends on like whatever someone's interested in, right? Whoever they follow. But the point is just to acknowledge like am I actually getting value from following this person? And again, it's zero sum. So don't think of it as like, am I getting any value? Because you could always justify getting some value from someone. But is it like, do I want to see a bunch of like 100 amazing people's tweets? Or do I want to dilute that with 5,000 people's tweets that I get maybe like 1% of the value from?
Yeah. It's funny. My tastes have changed over time. I used to be in the military and in the government and a speechwriter there at the Pentagon, for example. And so I was very interested professionally in politics and followed many people who would share political opinions. And over the last decade or so, I have become less and less interested in politics and more interested in the creator economy type stuff. And I think I just need to do what you're saying and just like sort of purge that away from my diet at this time.
One quick note on that just quickly is that I think one reason that we struggle with this at times is because if you think of the early social networks, it was something like Facebook, which is 1-to-1, which means that like I am literally friending you because we're agreeing that we're friends. But a lot of the newer social networks, it's not like that is not the framework to think about it. It is like I have this feed and I'm trying to optimize this feed for what delivers me the most value. Like I know this sounds terrible, but like I'm not friends with these people on Twitter, right? I'm trying to, they are providing me value and I'm taking that value from them. And then simultaneously, if someone follows me, hopefully they're getting value. But if they're not, they should also unfollow me, right? I've actually said this before on my Twitter and shared this framework of like 99 people. And people are like, oh, I guess I should unfollow you. And I'm like, yes, you should. If you are not getting value from me, you should, right? This is not like a Facebook friend environment. This is like a feed of information. And, coming back to the information diet, if you stuff yourself with junk food or terrible information, like you better bet that it's going to manifest in the way that your brain functions.
Yeah. I could stay on this topic forever with you, but I want to talk about writing with you because I heard you in a previous conversation say something that I think will be very reassuring for a lot of people. You're a successful creator, writer, and published content creator, and you don't like to write sometimes, or writing is hard for you. I think that may be a universal cliché potentially, but I'd love to hear you unspool on that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I always start with the story when people ask this, that in high school, at least where I grew up in Ontario, the only course you needed to take throughout your whole high school or throughout your whole like education before university was English class. And I hated it so much. I remember being so upset at this idea that I had to take English throughout, because I was always more, and still to this day, it's funny that people consider me as kind of like a content person. I've kind of leaned into that, of course, but I truly prefer spending my day in a spreadsheet versus a Google document. I always, even in high school, was upset about English because I preferred like maths and sciences. And so I think what's helped me a lot is this idea where when you take English growing up, there's a very particular way that you're expected to write, and a very particular way that you're expected to be graded, and a very particular set of topics that you're probably not interested that you're expected to write about. And then you get this feeling when you come back to writing where you're like, oh God, that was so exhausting. And you also remember, like when you're in school, you're trained to do it a certain way. So when you, again, sit down at a piece of paper or a Google Doc, your brain's still saying, oh, okay, I guess I like need to go through this approach, right? And what happens, or what I've found really useful, is like just acknowledging that and then remembering like writing or speaking, these are all forms of content, and all content is a way of communicating an idea to many people, right? Or hopefully many people. Could even just be one person, right? And that, when you realize that all that is like writing, whether it's on your blog or newsletter or otherwise, is just, again, communicating ideas, then you can kind of at least try to like rip out that structure that you had before and just say, oh, like how would I say this to a friend? Or like, what is the best way that I can communicate this idea? Sometimes that's in an image, right? So it doesn't have to be this like long form essay type writing. And again, I think one very important difference is as well that you can write about whatever the hell you want, which tends to be a lot more enjoyable when it's things that you care about. And so yes, I really, even with those changes, still struggle with writing, because I think, well, one, some people are just naturally born better at things than others. And I think I've always like been a little more analytical. But then it also just takes reps, right? And what I try to do with my writing process, if people are interested, just Google like Steph Smith writing is thinking. And what I try to do is some people who really, I think maybe writing comes a little more naturally to, can sit down and just like pump out an article and feel great about it. I really, really struggle with that. So I try to make writing as easy as possible. And that comes with, one, not having like consistent weekly deadlines. Some people would argue that's really important. I disagree with them. I think it's more important to inconsistently publish amazing stuff than consistently publish mediocre stuff.
Now that's a contrary opinion.
Yeah.
Pharrell would be very upset at you right now.
I'm sure he would, but I mean, I will stand by that. I think it's more important to publish amazing stuff inconsistently than mediocre stuff or even good stuff consistently. Well, I will caveat that and say when you're really early on and speaking to this idea of like getting better at writing, I think it's important to be consistent at the beginning so that you get your reps in. After that, I think that's where maybe I diverge from other people in their opinions. But to get back to the idea of like, I do struggle with writing, what I try to do is, one, not have like such severe constraints so that if you have severe constraints and you struggle with it, you're just not going to show up, right? So like, how do I make it easier for myself to show up? Well, I make it such that I don't actually have to adhere to these like really rigid schedules. I also, if you read that article, I will basically, the same way I did for my book, I learned for several years and like wrote a bunch of stuff down. For any article I have, I'll like start a document and then just start adding ideas to that document as I see something on Twitter, as a, I'm having a conversation with someone, or I just see something walking down the street. I'll add it to that such that when I am ready, quote unquote, to like go write the article, I basically have it like 70% written, right? And what I'm doing at that point is mostly just refining my ideas. And so I think it's important where, again, there's no like one size fits all, like this is how you should write. But if you can acknowledge the same way we talked earlier about acknowledge like how you're most productive, if you can acknowledge like what is most likely to get you to show up to writing or whatever skill you're trying to do, if you can reduce that friction, you're going to be much further ahead of most people, because most people will just like, if they see any amount of friction, like just avoid that, right? So if you can instead focus on like, okay, actually, how do I just reduce this friction? Then you're more bound to show up, which is, again, why it's funny to me that people refer to me as a writing person. And I don't feel that way internally. If someone's going to take any lesson away from that, it should be that everyone that you perceive to be like the writing person or the coding person or the whatever person also probably struggles with that to some degree and has just like learned to, again, reduce that friction. So don't let the friction within your own life, deter you from doing things that you think you can't do. Because I think in general, there's this saying I'll just close out with where someone recently told me, they were like, you're not bad at something, you're new to something. And I tweeted about it, and there's a lot of people who were like, no, I've been doing this for years, I'm just bad at it. I'm like, well, have you actually sat down to try to think about how to tackle this in like a new way and to do it and with like a very like intentional approach to getting better or reducing friction? And a lot of people are like, oh, no, I haven't. And the example I gave is like, I've cooked for my whole life, right? Like I have used a stove for my whole life. I am terrible at cooking, but when have I ever sat down to say like, hey, I'm going to actually like read a book and learn to cook, or get a coach, or actually when I'm cooking, like analyze what I'm doing or try to get better at it? And the answer is no. So I'm new to cooking, even though I'm not new to it in my life. I'm new to taking it on as a skill. And the same thing is true with, I think, a lot of things that people take on in life. So that was a long-winded way of saying that, yes, I still don't find writing super natural, but I think still a lot of other people don't as well. And I just focus on reducing the friction so that I can show up.
Yeah, what I've learned in writing is a measure of patience with myself. Often when I sit down and force myself to write about something that I'm not ready to write about, you'll hit a brick wall. But most of the time, all I'm really trying to figure out in my recesses of my brain is, what am I trying to say? And that will eventually dawn on you when there's enough. It's almost like a nuclear chain reaction. When there's enough quality content all gathered together in one place, which takes time, as you were saying, just like you just put stuff from your notes app or Evernote or whatever. If you've got enough nuclei together and they start colliding, it becomes much easier. And you wake up and you say, I know what I want to say. And there's this famous story with Bertrand Russell, who tried to write a series of lectures in 1913 or something like that, and he couldn't do it. And the date was fast approaching, like within a week or something. And he woke up one morning and dictated the whole thing. It took a year for him to figure it out. And
That's
so I
amazing.
tend to agree with you, by the way, that it's like better to do inconsistent things that you're inspired by, that kind of come to you in waves, if you will.
Yeah,
But
and of course, this doesn't apply to everyone. Where if you're working, like for, let's say you're running a publication and you have business goals, like that doesn't work. But that actually brings me back to the earlier thing that I said about not having this be your financial stability, where I can be inconsistent because it's not my financial stability. If it is, then you probably have to show up, and then it's going to be a lot less enjoyable when you have to show up to something versus when you want to show up to something.
yeah, I've noticed, like David Perel, for example, he's got systems running in the background. Like nowadays, his Monday Musings is a compilation of his tweets that week,
Exactly.
plus a couple of other things that's all automated, most likely. And I think one would agree with him that consistency is key to growth, but it goes back to what you said. You're not really focused on relentless growth like many other people are, because you're happy creating when you want to create, and you have this full-time job and so forth.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to maybe end our conversation today by talking about your goals and how you're doing, how you're tracking in 2021. What are some of them that stand out to you that are keeping you motivated?
Yeah, so I'm actually just going to pull open. So if anyone's interested, you can find my goals at my site at stephsmith.io/open. And I publicly share my personal goals. And these really relate to more so like not just my personal life, but my creations and like what projects I want to launch. And so you can see all of my goals from 2019 onwards. So for 2021, one of the things that I've struggled with in prior years is focusing on too many things and not really accomplishing any of them exceptionally well. So this year, one of the things that I wanted to do, which I actually have not done yet, but is return to writing. That's something that, again, I'm extremely inconsistent with that. And I haven't written an article on my blog for quite some time. And so I do want to return to that. I also have a goal of I had a goal of hitting $10,000 MRR. That kind of has been done through the book, which was unexpected. So there's that. I also want to launch a new project. I'm hoping to launch it later this year. I'm already working on it, but yeah, I guess TBD for people interested in that. And then in terms of my own like personal goals, I'm trying to learn automation because I think that will just help a lot of things in my life. And also, I just think it's important for people to be technically literate. And that's something that I want to like eat my own dog food. I learned how to do web development, but I want to learn to do automation and then exercise 182 days of the year. So I'm tracking behind, but I'm doing pretty good this month. I've run for the last, I think, 10 days.
I noticed that. So. I noticed that. It looked like
did you see my
I was like, wait, she's on a roll.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. If you look at remember earlier I said that I'm really inconsistent, and you can see that if you look at, I've been tracking my exercise for the last like 2019, 2020, and now 2021. And if you look at it, some people probably exercise like 3 times a week consistently, and I will go through these long periods and then I will like kick myself into gear and then, go on these sprints. But anyway, yeah, you can see a lot of my personal goals and how I'm tracking on that page.
Yeah, I have a theory about spirals, that things are negative spirals or positive spirals. And running is clearly one of those things. It's like I'm a transistor. I'm either on every day or not. And
exactly. I mean, it makes sense too, though, because, and I'm trying to like just stay in this positive spiral. Of course, it's hard to, but I find the same thing, especially with anything physical, because this is true for everything, where when you first start something, it's like harder. And with running, when I first started it is genuinely less enjoyable than when I'm at day 10, because my body is just in a different place where like the first day I like can't even run a mile without being like, oh, this is terrible. Like this is like such a terrible experience. And the same thing is true with yoga or any sort of physical thing. But it's also true with the things that we talked about, like writing or any sort of skill. The first couple days of it are absolutely grueling. And it's because your body is not used to it, whether it's like your physical body or your mind is not used to engaging in that thing. And so it becomes genuinely easier as you go. And so really, I think that first like maybe 3 days is the hardest whenever you're like starting in that positive spiral. So it's also just as important, if you can, to continue it, right? So that you're not like going down into the negative spiral where it's so much harder to kind of get out of that.
Absolutely. Well, Steph, congrats again on all your Gumroad success. Thank you for being here and greatly appreciated our conversation.
Thanks. These were awesome conversations, or this was an awesome conversation and great questions.